Sometimes, man, these guys just don't know what they have. So I want to try and start getting more into talking about comic books and what I do or don't like about comic books on this channel more. I kind of kicked it off with talking about some comic book tropes that I can't stand. Now I'm going to talk about something that exists in comics that I actually like quite a bit, but they also don't really do anymore. So this serves as both a praise and a complaint all bundled in one. Ha-ha! I can have layers, or, you know, I just can't not complain about things. In any case, I'm going to talk about legacy superheroes. Now, let's get some terminology out of the way first. So a legacy superhero is someone who has taken up the mantle of a hero who held that mantle before them. Now, this is different from alternate versions. This is different from clones. This is different from anything like that. So, you know, when we're talking about legacy characters, you know, the various clones of Spider-Man, those are not legacy versions of a character. Someone like Miles Morales is. So that's sort of what I'm talking about here. Now, legacy heroes kind of got kicked off in many ways by accident by DC, because the sort of kick in the butt for the entire Silver Age of comics, if you don't know, there's the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and then I suppose we're still considering ourselves to be in the Modern Age, except the Modern has been going on since the 80s. I don't know if they figured out something to transition it to. The reboot era? I don't know. But in any case, what kicked off the Silver Age in many ways was the introductions of Hal Jordan as the Green Lantern and Barry Allen as the Flash. Both of these were heroes that had existed prior to this. The Flash was originally Jay Garrick, and the Green Lantern was originally Alan Scott. But what DC did was they brought in new versions using the same name, having similar powers, in the case of Green Lantern having a whole new backstory, but it brought in this idea of, okay, the name of the hero we're going to keep because people know that and they like it, but we're going to put somebody else in that costume. They're going to have a different thing going for them. And that continued on from there, and I think by and large DC did it best, and I think it was partly because they just kind of stumbled into it. It wasn't necessarily by design for a lot of it. And then as time went along, there was a lot more legacy characters as DC sort of moved its way forward. Obviously, there were a lot more Green Lanterns. Barry Allen eventually died during Crisis on Infinite Earths to be replaced by Wally West. Batgirl ended up becoming a legacy character when Barbara Gordon became paralyzed and the mantle of Batgirl got taken up by somebody else. And in general, what I like about legacy characters is it allows you for a few things. The first thing, it allows you for clear sectioning off of different eras of a character, because any character that's been around for a long time, generally there's going to be different eras, and by and large you have to kind of section them off by creative team. Problem with that is, you know, creative teams can sometimes be very short-lived, you know, so short that you wouldn't even call, you know, some writers' times on a character an era. You know, you barely call it a run. So doing it by, especially if you're not a hardcore comics fan, you know, you might not even know the writer off the top of your head half the time. So that it's possible to section off by writer, and there's a validity to that, but I think there's an ease of sectioning things off by who's holding the mantle of that particular character. And the reason I like that is because as I'm getting older, I'm finding it harder to continue to find the joy in comic books. And it's not for some like stupid, books aren't as good as they were when I was reading them. I was reading them in the 90s. They weren't great then. But what's hard for me to get too far into a lot of comics these days. And I'll still read them, but I'm much more apt to pick up something that is new for a character I've never read before than I am, the latest issue of a character that I've loved for a long time. And the reason for that is I've come to really appreciate kind of the necessity of stories ending. And, certainly individual story arcs will end. But the longer characters go on, the more it feels like, well, there's no end to this story, and it can oftentimes sort of take the stakes out of things. And I don't mean in we know the hero's going to live way. We always know the hero's going to live, except when they make a stupid event out of it and kill them in the background needlessly and bloodily. So what I mean is that having some finality means that the decisions and the choices matter. The big problem with how long these characters are ongoing is how much of their development, either of them as characters or of their lives, eventually gets undone in reverse. This is some of the stuff that I talked about in my Tropes That I Hate video. Stuff gets undone and people aren't allowed to be happy. And a podcasting friend of mine, a guy by the name of Andrew Leyland, he has he has two podcasts. He has one he does with his son called Hey Kids Comics. They only do a couple of those a year now. Back catalog's great, though, if you want to listen to that. And his own show is Palace of Glittering Delights. And he talked about how he thought Amazing Spider-Man 99 would have been a really good last issue for Spider-Man. And I found myself thinking about that a lot because, on the one hand, the idea that Spider-Man was over, that's kind of like, well, I love Spider-Man. I don't want him to be over. But then at the same time, I think about all the crap that the character has been put through over the years to keep undoing his progress, dialing him back, obliterating his marriage, the crap that gets heaped onto him. How many times his Aunt May died and been brought back again and again and again? Nothing sticks. And I think the way that you get around that without having to retire the character is through the use of legacy characters, so that you can have the hero continue, but you can have the character have closure, have an ending, happy or tragic. But for me, knowing that these stories are never going to properly end becomes exhausting. And I just think legacy characters are a fantastic way around that. As I said, they don't do them as much as they used to. Marvel has started to kind of try and do them lately with mixed results, but I'm going to come back to that. First, let's get back to DC, because like I said, for a long time, legacy characters were kind of a DC thing. And then the New 52 happened. And there's a lot that I hate about the New 52. If you don't know a ton about comic books, New 52 was a reboot of the universe, and it lasted for about 5 years before they rejiggered the thing again with an event called Rebirth. That was, 2 years ago now. I can't keep track. In any case, New 52 hit the reset button, and more specifically brought back what were considered by the editorial staff at the time to be the iconic versions of the characters, meaning that and some of this had been set up ahead of time, but it meant that Barbara Gordon was Batgirl again. It meant that Hal Jordan was the Green Lantern again. It meant that Barry Allen was the Flash again. And on paper, that sounds fine, but in many ways, it's a big middle finger to a chunk of the readership, because some of these characters had been holding these mantles for decades. But all of a sudden, no, we're going back to this one from when the writer and the editors were kids that they think of as the proper one. We're bringing that one back. Wally West doesn't exist anymore. And it was a crappy thing to do. I mean, it was awful, honestly, in terms of treating your fans and acting like you're doing them a favor by wiping out stuff that they liked and cared about. Another podcasting friend of mine, the Irredeemable Shag, he's a huge fan of Firestorm. That's actually his Twitter, Firestorm fan. For him, because it's what he grew up reading, Firestorm is Ronnie Raymond and Professor Stein. The thing was that I remember a podcast where, I don't know if he actually realized it on air. It sounded like he might have, but his version of Firestorm that he thought of as this is Firestorm. Ronnie had been part of Firestorm for a shorter stretch of time than Jax was afterwards. Meaning the guy that in his mind was the pretender to the throne had held that mantle for longer, had more right to call himself Firestorm, really. But I think that's a good way to go about it, because you can as you want to with your person who's taken up the mantle. It becomes, I'm not going to say completely okay to revisit story points, because you don't want to get repetitive, but it becomes less egregious to do so. And you can revisit some of those themes, some of those events, you can call back to without literally putting the same character through the same things again. Now let's talk about Marvel. So like I said, DC kind of blew up the good thing that they had and didn't appreciate. Marvel really didn't do legacy characters for a long time. They would do like short-term substitute hero stories every now and then. Like there was a substitute Captain America for the course of a story for a while, and other people have taken up the mantle since then. Sam Wilson was Captain America for a little bit. I think Bucky was Captain America for a little bit. But those aren't really legacy characters, because they're not expected to maintain the mantle for very long. It's just for the course of whatever story is currently being told, and usually it's reversed within a year. So Marvel has tried, and I don't know if this is conscious on this part, if they saw that DC blew up their whole legacy thing and Marvel went, ooh, can we start to fill that niche? I don't know if it was conscious or not, but they've tried to do it more recently. And unfortunately, I think the fact that Marvel didn't used to do it has been part of why fans haven't taken to it in some cases. So some examples of legacy versions for Marvel, they did, I think she still is, they have a new Thor, and they have, I think they finally brought Wolverine back from the dead, or maybe they're about to. Again, I can't keep track anymore. But there was a new Wolverine, and they've done some of these sometimes quite significant step-ins, and these people taking up the mantle. Now, I don't want to get into the argument of how the fact that often these are radically different characters. In both the two that I cited, in the case of Wolverine and of Thor, they were taking mantles previously held by male characters and giving them to female characters. I don't want to get into that end of it, because that kind of becomes a mess, but I do think at least an element of some people's reluctance to go along with this is the fact that this just isn't something Marvel does. And so Marvel readers weren't really prepped for the idea of, no, that's not Thor anymore. This is Thor now. And I think inherently they were always going to resist that, at least to a certain extent. Because the most notable time that Marvel tried to do legacy characters prior to the last decade or so was in the 90s, again with Spider-Man, and a little mess called the Clone Saga. And I'm not going to rehash all this here, but one of the things that was supposed to happen was the clone of Spider-Man, who, at least for a brief stint, was supposed to be revealed to be the actual original version, and Peter was the clone. They reversed that later. But character Ben Reilly was meant to take up the mantle of Spider-Man. And on paper, that was actually not a bad idea, because the writers were many of the writers, again, calling back to my own video on tropes I can't stand, many writers were feeling frustrated by Peter Parker's home life and the fact that he had a wife, and that felt like too much stability, and they wanted to write classic swinging single Peter Parker. And the idea of having Peter retire to go off and have his happy life with his wife and finally be able to hang up the mask and have Ben Reilly take it over, on paper, honestly, I think it's a decent idea. They blew it on so many levels, introducing the idea that Ben was actually the original Peter Parker and Peter was the clone. That was a stupid idea, because that pissed readers off, because it made them feel like, wait, you're telling me we haven't even been following the real Peter Parker for the last 20, 30 years now? That's screwed up. So, that was a stupid idea. They should have just admitted from the beginning, no, Ben is a clone, and Peter isn't going to vanish and never appear again, but he's not going to be Spider-Man anymore. We're going to let him have a happy ending. But again, the Clone Saga story was such a mess. I mean, the end result was a disaster, and the writing of it, it was supposed to, I think, last a year. It dragged on years and years and years, and they didn't know where they were going with it, and there were so many things that went nowhere, or just it was a complete and total crapshoot. And I think that also soured Marvel fans on the idea of legacy characters. Now, has Marvel done legacy characters well? Yes, I actually think they have possibly the most successful legacy character of modern times, which is Kamala Khan as Ms. Marvel. And that one, they actually got really lucky in a way, because the classic Ms. Marvel, Carol Danvers, had been basically promoted, for lack of a better term, to Captain Marvel. She took up that mantle. And that actually left the mantle of Ms. Marvel unoccupied. And these were not connected things. They didn't move Ms. Marvel into taking the mantle of Captain Marvel in order to allow Kamala Khan to become Ms. Marvel. They were unconnected. And so when Kamala Khan stepped into the mantle of Ms. Marvel, it felt much more organic. It didn't feel like they were forcibly rejiggering things. It felt more like they went, oh, you know what, since we took Carol and we did this with her, we could have somebody else do this. Yeah, let's do that. And it had a much more organic feel to it, because it was a void that stood to be filled, as opposed to any feeling of elbowing out whoever was currently there in order to bring in somebody new. Because that's oftentimes the complaint I see now when any whether it's the movies or the comic books, or even fans just propose the idea of bringing in a new legacy version of a character, or and whether it's a brand new character or an established character who's going to take up the mantle. It's not uncommon for fans to go, look, if you want a new character, a new hero, just make a new character, a new hero. Why do you have to mess with the ones that are there? But I'm going to come back to what I said at the beginning. I think there's a satisfaction in bringing a story to a close that, again, I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for me, and I can say eventually it's distancing and alienating, and yeah, it kind of saps away my desire to keep reading comics, knowing that this character's gonna be doing this forever. And knowing that one day they can stop. Ideally with a happy ending, but for whatever reason, one day they can stop, and somebody reading after me gets to have their own Spider-Man, Wolverine, Superman, Batman, whatever. That they can have their version that is theirs. It's got nothing to do with me. And I don't even feel the need to wag my finger at them like, you're doing Spider-Man wrong. He wasn't like that. I was like, well, no, but that's not Peter Parker. That's Miles Morales, or that's whoever. And you go, oh, well, my version was better. And fine, be grumpy and have that, but you won't have to wag your finger at them anymore, because they're not screwing up your character. They just gave someone else a chance to do what they could do with that. And I can't help but feel that the heyday of legacy characters is come and gone. And we are now in an age where, like I said, DC just threw out what they had, and Marvel seems to have trouble finding the balance between doing something new and exciting and not taking off the fan base for one reason or another. And it's a shame, because I think it's one of the potentials of superhero comic books that was there for a little bit and has kind of been left to drift off and fade away. And those are my thoughts on legacy superheroes, what I like about them, why I wish they were being used more, and my thoughts on a few of the examples that I could think of off the top of my head. There are way more than I brought up, trust me. So what are your thoughts on legacy heroes? Do you have a personal favorite character where you like a later version of the character that came along as opposed to the original? Or do you want to name a legacy character where they totally screwed it up on the new person who took the mantle? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's a whole bunch of stuff to do. I think you know what it is. You're smart. You've been around here, because, there's buttons and there's links and stuff. There's a Patreon link. And, check that out if you want to. So remember, folks, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.